Eddie Rickenbacker was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1890 to Swiss immigrant parents. His father passed away at a young age, and he had to work jobs to earn income for his family. He got a job working for Lee Freyer, a race car driver and owner of the Freyer Miller Automobile Company. Freyer liked Rickenbacker and let him be his mechanic in many major races. Eventually, he worked his way into becoming a race car driver and earning the reputation of being a daring driver. He actually set a world record speed of 134 miles per hour at Daytona in 1914, but he wasn't able to win a trophy at Indianapolis. In November 1916, he had his first ride in an aircraft flown by Glenn Martin, and despite having a great fear of heights, Rickenbacker noted that he was not fearful during the flight because of who was the pilot of the plane. Despite being a wealthy race car driver, Rickenbacker aspired to be a pilot. He enlisted in the American Expeditionary Service, hoping to become a pilot. However, because he was overage and didn't have a college education, he was not qualified. Rickenbacker ended up being lucky enough to drive Colonel Billy Mitchell, the commander of the Air Service, in one of his race cars. Rickenbacker started to pressure Mitchell into helping him get around some of the regulations to become a pilot, and ended up enlisting as a 25-year-old despite being 27 years old. After just 17 days in pilot training, he joined the 94th Aero Squadron, also known as the Hat in the Ring Squadron, the first American unit to fly in combat. The squadron was tasked with engaging and clearing the enemy from the skies, as well as providing escort for recon and bombardment squadrons over enemy territory. Rickenbacker's first experiences in combat were harrowing, and he realized that being a pilot would take practice, and the French planes they were flying would need to be upgraded in order to keep up with the German pilots. It did not take long for Rickenbacker to rise to the title of ace after receiving his first confirmed aerial victory in April of 1918. And by May of 1918, he had achieved ace status after getting his fifth confirmed victory. While the death of Rickenbacker's famous ace friends such as Quentin Roosevelt and Frank Luke were tragic, he was able to learn and change his approaches to flying that made him more aware for future missions. And he shared what he had learned with other pilots so that they could also be successful and be more safe in the sky. As American forces began to push harder on the Western Front, the American pilots began to become more successful in the air, especially Rickenbacker, who quickly ascended to commander of the 94th Aero Squadron, earning the rank of captain. By October of 1918, Rick had been given the title America's Ace of Aces by the American press, a title that he actually disliked because he felt it carried the curse of death, since it had been given to other famous aces like David Putnam and Frank Luke. By the end of the war, he had earned the title Ace of Aces and had more than 24 aerial victories. He saw the most combat hours for any other American pilot, with a total of 300 hours, and survived 134 aerial encounters with the enemy. He had received practically every medal that could be attained, and in the 1930s, he received the U.S. Congressional Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross. After the war, he went into the automobile manufacturing industry and designed the first cars to have four-wheel brakes. In 1927, he bought a majority of the common stock of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and since that didn't take up much of his time, he created a comic strip called Ace Drummond and published a book called Fighting the Flying Circus, which were both based on his experiences in World War I. In 1926, he became involved in commercial aviation when he and some associates formed Florida Airways. But when that had died, he became vice president of the General Aviation Company, and then later the vice president and general manager of Eastern Air Transport. By 1934, Eastern Air was transporting passengers and mail from New York to Miami to Chicago. It was the first airline to operate as a free enterprise company without government subsidy. On February 26, 1941, Rick was aboard a DC-3 that smashed into trees on its approach to Atlanta. 11 passengers and the 2 pilots died. Rick was able to get away alive but badly injured. His injuries made him unable to work for nearly a year. By the end of 1941, Eastern Air had 40 DC-3s and at that time, America had entered into World War II. Eastern had to give up half its fleet to the military war effort. In September 1942, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson asked Rickenbacker to visit England and evaluate some equipment and personnel because of his understanding of military aviation. He was offered positions in the military, but Rickenbacker had refused. Stimson sent Rick on a number of other similar inspection missions, including one to the Pacific. On his way to the bases in the Pacific from Honolulu on a B-17, the pilot got lost, ran out of fuel, and had to ditch the plane. For the next 22 days, Rick and the other crew members that were on the B-17 were stranded in the Pacific Ocean. Luckily, Rick took command of the situation over the men and helped them ration food and survived on the rafts in the ocean until they were rescued. Despite this traumatic experience, Rick continued to visit some war bases and give recommendations. Eventually, many people started to think that Rick would be a strong candidate for president against Roosevelt, and while he was honored, he believed that he didn't have a strong chance of winning because he was too controversial. In 1963, Rickenbacker retired and bought a ranch in Texas with his wife, but they decided that it was too remote for them, and so they donated the ranch to the Boy Scouts and then moved to New York City, and eventually they moved to Florida, where in October 1972, Rick suffered a stroke and recovered enough to travel to Switzerland one last time, where he passed away on July 23, 1973 from pneumonia. Unfortunately, there are some negative things that come to be known about how Rickenbacker acted outside of the airplane. His personality turned people away, as he was known for being blunt and had a way of chewing out his subordinates. Rickenbacker wasn't able to get used to the idea of women working for the airline, even as stewardesses. He believed that male stewards were better because they were less likely to leave the company after being trained. He worked a 7-day work week and believed that his workers should even work on Saturdays. Many of his colleagues believed he was all talk and wasn't actually tough, so they didn't take much of what he said to heart. As seen throughout the stories of many people who are blunt and maybe don't have a filter towards coworkers or subordinates, people start to become turned away from their personality. This aspect of Rickenbacker's personality can be labeled as a negative legacy because it turned people away and paints him in a negative light, as opposed to being a leader that everyone wanted to follow and work for. The most obvious positive legacies are seen in the advances he made in the automobile world by creating the first cars to have four-wheel brakes, and in the airplane industry by his contribution towards policies in the airplane industry he advocated for with the government behind the Eastern Airlines company that he owned and operated. But his story of becoming the ace of aces during World War I continues to be an inspirational framework for what hard work and intelligence can do for someone with determination and a desire to succeed.